Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The 12 Malaysia Plan, which was tabled in Parliament yesterday, included a slew of environmental targets, which include a pledge for Malaysia to become a carbon neutral country as early as 2050, for carbon pricing and carbon tax to be introduced, and for a comprehensive national energy policy to be introduced as a long-term roadmap. Now, how do we ensure that all these carbon emission reduction measures go beyond just impressive pledges? Tonight on the show, we discuss. Our first guest is Yin Xiaolong, who is a senior research associate at Khazanah Research Institute. Xiaolong, good evening. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight. The carbon neutrality pledge, I mean, it appears to be the most ambitious one in Southeast Asia. If I were to compare, Thailand has one that's targeted for carbon neutrality by 2065, Indonesia for net zero emissions by 2060. So looking at all these environmental pledges under the 12 Malaysia Plan, I'm just wondering whether you see more than just lip service. You see, in fact, measures that implementable measures that reassure you that we can achieve this carbon neutrality target.
Hi, good evening, guys. Thanks for having me on. I think it's a significant target that has been announced recently, and it was a pleasant surprise. And I think we have to commend the Economic Planning Unit and the PM's department for pushing up the agenda. And I think it's notable because, as you've pointed out, we're not alone in the region, and in fact, we're the second highest emitter in Southeast Asia. So the spotlight will be on Malaysia sooner or later, and I think it's important to get an early head start in the tremendous labor that's involved in ensuring an energy transition, to change the energetic basis of our economy from primarily based on fossil fuels, and that's mainly coal right now, towards something cleaner and consistent with international climate goals to prevent catastrophic climate change by 2050.
Xiaolong, does this put us basically or align us with, say, the European Union? I think it also has a 2050 target, and I think Paris also set that as a target. But in the European case, and I don't know it well, correct me if I'm wrong, it's also wrapped up in this idea of a new Green Deal. It's got a comprehensive look at the economy and such. Do you see the similarities? Do you see where this is coming from, the particular way in which it's articulated in the 12th Malaysia Plan?
I think there's definitely some international signaling going on because, I mean, the 12th Malaysia Plan is a bit of a global-facing or international-facing document coming out of the government. It references things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, the audience for that isn't so big in Malaysia, but there is an international audience for it. And likewise, I think the climate goals are also trying to speak to those international audiences, especially as the countries of the world, Malaysia included, head to Glasgow in November for the 26th Conference of the Parties for the United Nations Climate Change Convention. So I think putting it around, framing it in terms of carbon neutral and framing it as a 2050 goal definitely puts it in line with what developed countries such as the EU, the US as well has a similar kind of goal. At the same time, I think it's important to stress under the terms of the convention, developing countries like Malaysia, even though we're almost at the high income stage, we don't share the same historical responsibility for putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere as Western countries who maybe had their industrial revolution in the 1800s, like Britain and the US and Europe and so forth. So this is a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities, right? We have a common responsibility to save the planet, but our responsibilities are differentiated not just by our historical responsibility, but also our present and future capability to pay and finance change as well.
I'm just wondering, Xiaolong, whether you think our climate change plans, as a country, whether our policies to address the climate crisis, are those policies in any way vulnerable to the vagaries of Malaysian politics?
I would actually say the reverse appears to have been true, right? I mean, if you look at how our kind of global climate signaling in terms of targets started with Najib in 2009, just after he became PM. He wanted to make a big deal at the Copenhagen conference. So he announced the original greenhouse gas emissions intensity reduction target of 40% by 2020. Now, we've kind of failed to meet that. I think that's why it hasn't gone mentioned in reports of late. So we've revised the target recently to 45% by 35, and and that's gone through 4 prime ministers already, and and this 4th prime minister in just as many years has put it at the headline of his speech in Parliament just yesterday. So I think it's shown that the climate agenda has moved ahead. I think the government, civil service particularly, recognize the importance of that, and they've put Malaysia squarely on track to try and tackle this immensely difficult problem and necessary problem.
Is there any sense, Xiaolong, about why targets fail to be achieved? Are there structural barriers? Is there something in the mix that's not being, as it were, put in place so that targets can be achieved?
Well, the greenhouse gas target that we have is what they call an emissions intensity target relative to our gross domestic product, right? So it's linking it's kind of the energy efficiency, if you like, of the economy. If the GDP grows at a high rate, then you also reduce the emissions intensity. Of course, 2020 was a bit of a bum year for economic growth for everybody, not just Malaysia. That might have cramped the target as well. I think around 2016, we were doing quite well in terms of hitting the target. But I think also, maybe increasing energy consumption a little bit beyond plan, as well as lower than expected growth, would have made it a bit tougher to achieve in terms of emissions in relation to GDP.
Right. Xiaolong, a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the show tonight. That was Yin Xiaolong from Khazanah Research Institute. Stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back in just a couple of minutes.
Adakah penyelesaian rangkaian awan dapat meningkatkan hasil
Ayuh
perniagaan?
keluarga Malaysia, kita bulatkan tekad dan bersatu hati untuk terus memelihara serta mempertahankan kedaulatan negara. Sebagai keluarga Malaysia yang besar, kita harus bertoleransi dalam semua perkara. Hormat menghormati serta mengekalkan perpaduan rakyat yang berbilang kaum, agama dan bangsa, serta integrasi nasional silang budaya adalah tunjang kekuatan kita sebagai sebuah negara bangsa yang berjaya. Umpama selembar benang dikait, ditenun dan dijalin, akhirnya menjadi kain yang sempurna indah.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kuttan. If you've just joined us on the show, we're discussing the 12th Malaysia Plan. It was tabled in Parliament yesterday. Tonight, we're zooming in on the policy roadmap that's been outlined for the environment. Now, Elizabeth Wong is the Selangor State Assembly person for Bukit Lanjan and chairperson of Selangor Backbenchers Club. She joins us on the show now. Elizabeth, good evening. Thank you for being on the show. Under the 12th Malaysia Plan, State governments are now going to be urged to conduct public hearings before any de-gazettement of permanent reserve forests or permanent reserve forest estates. Now, I'm just wondering whether, because if I understand correctly, Selangor is the only state to have made this a legal requirement, right, to conduct public inquiries before reserve acquisition. How do you welcome this news that now perhaps other states might also have to be compelled to do the same?
Hi, Melissa. Hi, Sharad. Thanks for having me on tonight. Well, in Selangor, we actually had this put into our state forestry law about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, it's very lonely. Selangor is the only one. But, through our discussions many times with the minister, this, in fact, is one of the key issues which the forestry department they want to see this happen not only in Selangor, but also in all the other states. But of course, we all have this issue in Malaysia where forests are deemed to be under state rule. So what it means is the states have absolute jurisdiction over forests. So how do we go about this? So my point is, when I read this, I was really happy that at least, something that we fought for the last 10 years is coming out to the fore. But to wait for the other states to come on board, it may take another 10, 20 years, which would mean that it will be the 14th or 15th Malaysia plan. So I am actually suggesting that the federal government look into amending the National Forestry Law itself and also finding ways to incentivize, to compel or to encourage other states to embed this particular amendment to their own state forestry law.
Elizabeth, I mean, you point to a very important fact of Malaysian political life, and that is the federal nature of the state, right? And we have now also, Sabah and Sarawak as territories, and their demands for autonomy and for establishing their own growth trajectory and development goals. How do you think something like the 12th Malaysia Plan, with these ambitious environmental targets, can be achieved over that political landscape, the landscape of the federation?
Well, at the national level, these issues are not new. Whether it's forest conservation or marine or ocean conservation, these issues are discussed, debated all the time between states and also in the federal setting. So for example, forestry issues is brought up at the National Land Council. This is attended by all the Menteri Besars, all the chief ministers, together with the prime minister chairs this particular council with all the ministers involved in this. So this is one venue which the prime minister has to assert his, or in the future, his or her political will to ensure that the states see this, for example, forest conservation as something critical to the growth of the nation, critical to the sustainability of our economic growth. And to be very frank, let's put some money where this issue is. We need funds. All the states, why are they going into forests? Because they need money. It's easy to get money out of forests. It's easy to sell timber and to have development in forest areas. So the federal government has to look into incentivizing, finding funds to ensure that forests are conserved and rehabilitated and expanded through these next 5 years.
All right. Elizabeth, I completely agree with you. I think that it is completely welcome news that, other states are required, will now hopefully be required to conduct public inquiries before any reserve acquisition. We've seen how important public inquiries are, particularly in the case of the Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve. But that's just one part of the problem, because if I understand correctly again, EXCOs are not obligated to act according to what the findings of the inquiry are, or for members of the Dewan or Aduns to have a say in matters of forest reserve acquisitions. Is that correct? Is that something that can also be addressed, you reckon?
Well, this is just one part, I believe. Why we have been advocating for public hearings? It is primarily because people say that overnight only then they realize that the forests have been, degazetted, when all the excavators and all the, chainsaws have all gone inside. Only then they realize that. So one thing is, we have to inform the public what the state has to do, or what the state plans to do. The second thing is we also have to provide avenues for people to put their views, whether they are for or against degazetting of the forest. This is just one part. I am actually advocating what I call a 5-star criteria for Malaysia to adopt. This is a conservation-based Malaysia plan for forest reserves. One is, so apart from having a public hearing process, there should also be, at the same time, a moratorium on commercial logging. I think, in this kind of political, economic climate, these days, having rainforests chopped down is just not politically correct. And a lot of the countries would not even accept those timber. The third point, apart from public hearing and moratorium, I am advocating for forest reserves. If there is a need to be degazetted, it should only be degazetted for public purposes, meaning no private projects, no development, housing development, things like that, because these are considered national heritage. Then the other thing would be they have to replace it. If you take away 5 acres, you have to replace 10 acres.
Okay, listen, sorry to cut you short. The remaining 1 minute, very quickly, do you think there's a political consensus that the political parties that, all aspire power in this country have signed on? Is there a consensus on the environment, on climate change, on such commitments?
I want to believe that there are many points which the state, the political parties are agreeing on today. So but to activate that, to make sure that it happens, we need civil society. We need also political activists to make sure that they follow for example, the 12 Malaysia plan. I think the plan itself looks okay, but implementation and, of course, finance is the most important thing.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Elizabeth Wong. That was Elizabeth Wong, the Selangor State Assembly person for Bukit Lanjang. We're going to take another quick break, but we will be back with more. Stay tuned to Consider This.
Ayuh keluarga Malaysia, kita bulatkan tekad dan bersatu hati untuk terus memelihara serta mempertahankan kedaulatan negara. Sebagai keluarga Malaysia yang besar, kita harus bertoleransi dalam semua perkara. Hormat menghormati serta mengekalkan perpaduan rakyat yang berbilang kaum, agama dan bangsa, serta integrasi nasional silang budaya adalah tunjang kekuatan kita sebagai sebuah negara bangsa yang berjaya. Umpama selembar benang dikait, ditenun dan dijalin, akhirnya menjadi kain yang sempurna indah.
Ayo kita zahirkan impian bersama, menjunjung semangat yang bernama keluarga Malaysia.
Thank you so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. We continue our discussion on the 12th Malaysia plan that was tabled yesterday. We're focusing on the environmental targets that have been put forth. Joining us now is Aliza Mahadi, the Director of Research at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies Malaysia, or also known as ISIS Malaysia. He previously worked with the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister and Chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Alizan, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us tonight. Let's get your first impression of the environmental targets under the 12th Malaysia Plan. I'm just wondering for you, whether specifically there were any game changers or any glaring gaps with what was proposed.
Right. Thank you and good evening. First of all, I think there is no doubt that this year's or this 5-year plan for the next 5 years is certainly more prominent than in previous years when you talk about environment and in particular green growth. You can see this firstly in the advancing sustainability is one of 3 themes and with 2 additional chapters. When you look at the previous Malaysia plans, environment was only 1 out of 10 pillars, and in the 10th plan you can see that environment was subsumed under a larger pillar of focusing on quality of life. So it certainly is more prominent, and with this, presumably, it will also result in higher allocation of resources as well. But the real game-changing element is not only that it is a standalone chapter on environment, but the fact that it is also mainstream in other sections of the 12th plan as well. One of the major challenges of environmental policy is the fact that it is cross-cutting and requires coherence across other sectors as well. So the previous plans we have seen, sometimes we have conflicting objectives such as reducing emissions, but at the same time increasing coal-fired plants, increasing car ownership, at the same time also with the aim of reducing emissions and so on. But this year we can see that, for example, there are focus on green mobility, there is focus on within the overall agenda of restoring growth, there's a focus on scaling up green practices, there's a focus on green industry, eco-industrial parks, sustainability in the tourism sector, and so on. So the game changer here is that you can see the concept of green growth starting to be mainstream across all the other sectors as well and throughout the 12th Malaysia plan. And that is certainly something very new. In terms of the gaps, I think... Sure.
Sweet. Please go ahead, please.
In terms of the gap, the main question still remains whether these will translate into implementation. I think that's the main question that we still will have to see. Because many of the language used, you use words such as encouraging actions, discouraging some other actions, promoting, and so on. And while there are specific elements focused on specific instruments, economic instruments, legal instruments, and so on, but generally speaking, a lot of it is still quite aspirational in that sense, and how we want to encourage this shift towards circular economy, towards green growth is still a big question, I think, moving forward. The transition to green growth is really a transformative agenda. This will require strong regulations, strong enforcement, large incentives. And again, while it does provide the basis for it, it remains to be seen whether it can be initiated in the next 5 years.
Right, Alizan, do you see, in different contexts, there's always a sense that there's a dividend paid out to the population in general in terms of growth in jobs and, quality of life. Those dividends from going green, as it were, is that articulated enough? Do you think that there's enough for the public to chew on, for them to see a reason to buy into this particular agenda? Well, I think the focus, especially for the green growth, is focused to the private sector. Specifically, there's a lot of mention, for example, on the importance of not just large corporations, but also SMEs to transition to a circular economy and to also adopt ESG practices. So there's a lot of focus on transitioning to green growth driven by the private sector. For the public at large, I think there is quite a bit of attempt to that. There is a strategy focusing on encouraging a sense of ownership, a model of shared responsibility, which is one of the strategies under the green growth. But again, the 12 Malaysia plan is I think 532 pages. Whether that in itself, the message will appeal to the general public, I think we will see.
I'm curious, Alizan, about the carbon pricing and the carbon tax that they said would be introduced, but no details announced yet. And I'm just wondering whether this might be a challenging element to put forth, particularly in trying to get public and private sector buy-in. What are the challenges you foresee in this particular area?
Well, first of all, of course, any tax being introduced certainly will not be popular, especially to interested parties that will be affected by it. So tax in general is always unpopular. In the time of economic recession, in the time of economic recovery from COVID-19, of course, it would be quite an unpopular thing to introduce a tax. However, when you look at carbon tax, in particular, carbon pricing preceding it, carbon tax has been one of the most effective instruments for reducing carbon emissions. So therefore, I think it's something worthwhile looking into. And I think, as I understand it, the 12 Malaysia plan is looking into feasibility of implementing this carbon tax rather than introducing forthright. I think recently the government also announced a domestic emissions trading scheme to be developed, and therefore I do not actually see a carbon tax to be implemented immediately.
Right.
But also the key thing, if I can add here, about carbon tax system is really the design of it. There are key questions. For example, the revenue you receive from carbon tax, where do you channel that revenue to? For example, if it is designed to also assist B40 households, if it is designed to channel back into climate action, into climate change adaptation, and so on, it could possibly work. But if it is, if it punishes or if it results in burdening, especially B40 households, etc., then perhaps is something that will not be workable. So the design of the carbon tax system itself, if you were to pursue it, is very important.
All right, Alizan, thank you for joining us on the show, helping us think through some of these important issues. Thank you. That was Alizan Mahadi of ISIS Malaysia, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. But before I leave you tonight, a reminder that you can get the latest COVID-19 vaccine information on astroawani.com, as well as the Astro Awani app. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching the show. Good night.